I was looking for somewhere remote, not just quiet, not just out of the way, but truly alone. The kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear. That was what I wanted. Not for any dramatic reason, just to get away, to clear my head, to have space to breathe. I found it after days of scouring online listings and backwoods forums. A small, privately owned cabin deep in the Idaho wilderness. No electricity, no running water, but a wood stove, a cot, and a roof over my head. The listing mentioned an old well for water and an outhouse about 20 yards from the front door. The nearest road was 4 miles away, a dirt track that barely qualified as drivable. The last half-mile had to be hiked in. It was perfect. I packed light. A sleeping bag, a hatchet, a knife, some basic cooking supplies, food to last a week, and a few extra layers. I had my old GPS, a paper map as backup, and a satellite phone in case of emergency. I wasn't completely reckless. The drive took most of the day, long stretches of highway giving way to narrower roads, then gravel, then dirt. By the time I reached the pull-off where I'd leave my truck, the sun was already dropping. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started walking. The trail was barely visible, more like a game path than a real trail, winding through dense trees. It was quiet out here, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your chest. No hum of traffic, no distant voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of a bird. The cabin was smaller than I expected, barely more than a shack. A single window with wooden shutters, a door held closed with a rusty latch. The wood was old but sturdy, the roof patched in places but intact. There were no footprints in the dirt outside, no signs of recent visitors. That was good. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The cot was against the back wall, a small wood stove in the corner, a rickety table with a single chair, a few shelves, mostly empty except for an old tin cup and a rusted can opener. No electricity meant no lights, so I set up my lantern on the table and lit it. Shadows flickered against the walls. I checked the well first, dropping the old metal bucket down and hauling it up, the rope frayed but still strong. The water looked clear enough, but I boiled it just to be safe. The outhouse was as bad as expected, a wooden box over a pit, but it would do. That first night was uneventful. Cold, but the sleeping bag and layers kept me warm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters, but I slept through most of it. The second day I explored. No trails led anywhere useful, just thick trees and underbrush. I found an old, rusted can near a fire pit behind the cabin, but no other signs of past campers. It felt untouched, forgotten, just what I wanted. The second night I heard something. I was dozing off when a sound snapped me awake. Not the wind, not an animal. A distinct sound, metal scraping against wood. I lay still, breath shallow, listening. Then silence. I sat up slowly, reached for my knife. The lantern was still burning, casting long shadows. I waited. Nothing. Finally, I got up, heart hammering, and checked the door. It was still latched from the inside. I peered through a crack in the shutters but saw nothing. Just darkness. Maybe it was an animal, something brushing against the outside. I forced myself to lie back down. It was a long time before I slept. The third day, I found the footprints. I had gone out to get more water from the well when I saw them. Just a few feet from the front door, half covered by dirt and leaves. Human, barefoot. The prints were deep, pressed hard into the ground. Someone had been standing there, right outside my door, last night. I swallowed hard, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The footprints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the undergrowth. I followed them for a few yards before losing them in the thick brush. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it was nothing. Some drifter maybe passing through. But there was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin wasn't on any map. It wasn't advertised anywhere public. The only people who knew about it were the owner, me, and whoever had been standing outside my door last night. I kept my knife closer that night. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind. I was awake, heart pounding, listening. The fourth day, I hiked out to my truck. I didn't plan on leaving yet, but I needed to know it was still there. It was untouched. I considered leaving then, just getting in and driving away. But I hadn't seen anything, not really, just footprints, and I had paid for the full week. I told myself I was being paranoid. The fourth night, I heard it again. This time, it was the shutters. A slow, deliberate scrape of wood against wood. I sat up so fast my head spun. The lantern was out. Total darkness. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on. Nothing. I stood slowly, knife in one hand, light in the other. My breath came fast and shallow. The door was still latched. The window was still shut. But someone had been outside. Again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my bag. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. More footprints, more than before, circling the cabin. I didn't stop to look. I just started walking. The hike out felt longer than before, every snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. When I reached the truck, I tossed my bag in and locked the doors before I even started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man was standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, barefoot, watching. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement. I never went back. I rented the cabin at the end of a long dirt road, deep in the woods, thinking it would be the perfect place to get away for a few days. The listing described it as remote and rustic with no cell service, but I wanted that. A break from everything. Just me, the trees, and quiet. It was late afternoon when I pulled up. The place looked even more isolated than I expected. The dirt road ended in a clearing, the trees pressing in close on all sides. The cabin itself was small and weathered, with a steep roof and a sagging porch. No other houses, no signs of life. Just the whispering trees and the faint sound of the wind moving through them. I parked my truck beside the cabin and stretched my legs. The air was crisp, carrying the damp scent of moss and pine needles. It felt good to be away from everything, though there was an uneasy sort of silence. No birds, no insects, just stillness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was basic. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed against the far wall. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner and a stack of firewood beside it. The bathroom was little more than a closet with a toilet and a small sink. A single window looked out into the thick woods. I set down my bag and checked around. The place was clean but felt unused. A fine layer of dust coated the table and windowsill. The air smelled stale. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, then stepped back outside to grab more supplies from my truck. That's when I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the dirt near my truck. Big, booted footprints. They weren't mine. I had just arrived, and I could see my own prints leading up from where I parked. But these were deeper, older. They led toward the cabin's porch, stopping just before the steps. Then they turned and disappeared into the woods. I scanned the tree line, but everything was still. Maybe they were from the owner or a past renter. That made sense. Still, something about them unsettled me. I shook it off and went back inside, locking the door behind me. It was nothing, just my mind making something out of nothing. As the sun dropped, I got a fire going in the stove and cooked a simple meal on the gas burner. The food was warm, the fire crackled, and for a while, I started to relax. The cabin felt almost cozy, until I heard the first sound. A slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. Not from inside the cabin, from the porch. I froze, listening. The fire popped in the stove, but otherwise, the cabin was silent. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Maybe an animal. Maybe the wood settling in the cold. Then another creak, closer to the door. My skin went cold. I reached for my flashlight and turned it off to let my eyes adjust. The fire still cast a faint glow, flickering across the walls. I stood there, barely breathing, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I stepped toward the window, angling myself to peek out without being seen. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond was empty. I waited a long time, my heart hammering in my chest, but nothing else happened. After a while, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination or the wind shifting the wood. Still, I double-checked the lock on the door before going to bed. I slept lightly, waking up several times to the sound of the wind outside. Each time, I lay there listening, waiting, but there were no more noises on the porch. Eventually, I drifted off completely. In the morning, I stepped outside, stretching in the cold air. That's when I saw them. More footprints. Not mine. Not the old ones. These were fresh. They led from the woods straight to my cabin. Straight to my door. And then they stopped. No turn, no retreat. Just a set of deep, heavy prints ending at my door. I stood there for a long moment, staring down at them. My stomach felt hollow. My truck was right there, I could leave. But what if whoever made those prints was still out there, watching me? I scanned the trees. Nothing. Slowly, I backed up onto the porch, then inside. I locked the door and checked every window. Still nothing. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I considered leaving, but the rational part of me kept trying to explain it away. Maybe the prints had been there before and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe they weren't as fresh as they looked. By nightfall, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I sat by the fire with my back to the wall, my flashlight in my lap. The woods outside were silent. Then, just past midnight, something changed. The silence grew heavier, like the air itself had thickened. Then, a faint rustling outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. Then footsteps, slow crunching through the leaves. Closer. I gripped my flashlight, barely breathing. The steps reached the porch. Then another sound. A slow, dragging noise. Something heavy being pulled across the wood. I reached for my truck keys, ready to run, when suddenly, the sound stopped. Everything went still. Then, a sharp, deliberate knock at the door. Just once. Hard. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Another knock. Slow. Solid. I clenched my teeth, my mind racing. The door was locked, but it was just an old wooden latch. If someone wanted in, they could break it easily. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps retreated. Slow, heavy steps moving away from the porch. Then silence. I didn't move for hours, listening, waiting. When the first hint of dawn lit the trees, I finally found the courage to move. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and my flashlight. I yanked open the door and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone, except the porch rail. Deep scratches, gouged into the wood. Not from an animal. Long, deliberate marks. I didn't wait. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The tires spun on the damp dirt before catching, and I tore down the road, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't relax until I hit pavement. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin that night. I didn't want to. I took a cabin rental deep in the mountains to get away from everything. Work had been relentless, city noise never stopped, and I needed space where I didn't have to hear anything but the wind through trees. A friend of a friend owned a cabin way off the main roads. No cell signal, no internet, nothing but old forestry roads leading up into the wilderness. I drove out early in the morning, winding up narrow dirt roads, pushing my old truck harder than I should have. The trees thickened as I climbed higher, and eventually I found the turnoff. A barely visible break in the trees, the driveway almost overgrown. I had to push through hanging branches just to get my truck in. The cabin was a simple A-frame, small and old, with a steeply pitched roof and dark wooden siding. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees, and the whole place had a quiet stillness, like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. There were no neighbors, no distant hum of a highway, just the whisper of wind moving through the trees. Inside, it was basic. A wood-burning stove, an old gas range, a fridge running off a propane tank, and a loft with a single mattress. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked around, opening dusty windows and letting in fresh air. There were old hunting magazines stacked by the stove, a few rusty tools on the counter, and a musty smell of wood and thyme. I unpacked, set up a small fire, and settled in. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the small porch with a beer, listening to the sounds of the woods, the occasional creak of tree limbs shifting in the breeze. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the silence I'd been craving for months. It was the second night that I noticed something was off. I was outside gathering firewood just before dark when I saw it. A set of boot prints leading away from the porch. Not mine. They were deep, pressed into the damp soil, leading from the front of the cabin toward the trees. I hadn't noticed them before, and I told myself they were probably old, maybe from the last person who stayed here. But they were sharp, fresh-looking. I stood there, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing, just the thickening dusk and the smell of pine. I brought the firewood inside, locked the door, and told myself it was nothing. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise, not the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was the distinct sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The only light inside was the faint glow of embers in the stove. I strained to hear more, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then a creak. The porch had a loose board near the railing. I'd noticed it earlier. Someone had stepped on it. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the nightstand. My truck keys were in my bag by the door, but I didn't want to move yet. I stood still, heart hammering, waiting for another sound. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, listening to the silence pressing against the cabin walls. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer stepping onto the porch or a raccoon. Something explainable. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the porch. The footprints were back, and this time they led toward the door. The boards were scuffed, like someone had stood there for a long time. The air felt different now, the silence less peaceful and more oppressive. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything else. Signs of a person, broken branches, anything. But the woods were still, undisturbed beyond the tracks. I should have left then. I knew that, but I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting the isolation get to me. I stayed, forcing myself through the day like nothing was wrong, hiking a little, chopping some wood, trying to act normal. But as night came, I locked every door and window, keeping the axe within reach. The third night was worse. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape against the wood of the cabin. It moved, starting near the front door, then shifting along the side, toward the back. My chest tightened. I wanted to believe it was a branch in the wind, but the night was still. The air outside was dead, thick with waiting. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. The scratching stopped, then a soft thud, a weight against the back wall. I stood, moving as quietly as I could, and peered out one of the small back windows. My breath caught in my throat. A shape stood just beyond the treeline. Person, motionless, watching. They weren't holding a flashlight, weren't moving, just standing there in the dark, barely visible against the trees. I stared, heart pounding, willing them to move, to explain themselves, to do something other than stand there. They didn't. I backed away from the window, grabbed my keys, and forced myself to move. My truck was parked just outside. If I moved fast, I could make it. I took one last look outside. The figure was gone. I ran. I didn't look around, didn't stop to listen. I just threw open the cabin door, sprinted to the truck, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, roaring to life, and my headlights flooded the clearing. Nothing. The trees stood silent. The porch was empty. No footprints in the dirt. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. Something was wrong. I reversed too fast, nearly hitting a stump as I backed onto the narrow dirt road. I drove without stopping, hands tight on the wheel, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds. The forest pressed in on either side, dark and unmoving. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on paved roads, that I started to breathe normally again. I made it home before sunrise, locked every door in my apartment, and sat in the silence of my own space, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never went back to that cabin. I never called to ask who else had been there last, if anyone was supposed to be around. I didn't want to know. I still don't. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive up had been long. The last 30 miles, nothing but winding dirt roads cutting through dense forest. It was the kind of place you wouldn't just stumble upon. I had rented it online, one of those remote off-grid places meant to give people an escape from everything. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no cell reception. Just a solar battery for lights and an old wood stove for heat. I planned this trip for months. A full week alone in the middle of nowhere to clear my head. The cabin was small but solid. Thick logs made up the walls, the windows had sturdy wooden shutters, and the roof looked well maintained. A single front porch overlooked a clearing, the forest pressing in on all sides. There was a fire pit a few yards away, its stones blackened from past use. A small shed stood off to the side, its door slightly ajar. I made a mental note to check inside later. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single bed pushed against the wall, a worn-out couch, a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen area with an old propane stove and a small table with 2 chairs. Everything smelled like cedar and dust. I set my bag down and checked the solar battery gauge. It was nearly full, enough to keep the lights working if I used them sparingly. The bathroom was an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin. That would take some getting used to. I made a quick dinner, heated some soup on the propane stove, and ate it on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. The quiet was absolute. No distant highways, no humming appliances. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It was peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. I brushed the feeling off. I was just adjusting to being alone. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped. I stoked the wood stove, the fire crackling as I settled into the couch with a book. Every so often, I heard small noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Normal forest sounds, I told myself, the kind you ignore when you have the background noise of civilization. Now they felt amplified. The woods were alive, shifting and creaking in the dark. I turned in early, crawling into the bed and pulling the thick blankets over me. The fire cast flickering shadows across the walls. The forest sounds continued, distant and harmless. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it, footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching over leaves, moving toward the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, a bear. But then I heard the sound change. The creak of wood, the front porch. Someone was outside. I held perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears for any sound, any clue of what was out there. Nothing, just the faint crackling of embers in the wood stove. Minutes passed. My heartbeat slowed. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the old wood of the porch was just settling with the temperature drop. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. The door was locked. I had made sure of it. The rattling was brief, just a small test. Whoever was out there didn't try to force it. They just tested it. Then silence again. Long, agonizing minutes of nothing. I lay awake for hours, every muscle tense, listening. But the footsteps never returned. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came slow. The first thing I did was check outside. The ground was damp from dew, the leaves darkened with moisture. But there, leading up to the porch, were footprints. Deep, clear impressions of boots in the dirt. My stomach turned. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night and tried the door. I scanned the tree line, my nerves on edge. Nothing moved, just an endless wall of trees. I told myself it was some lost hiker, someone who hadn't realized the cabin was occupied. But it didn't sit right. Why come all the way up to the porch? Why test the doorknob and then leave? I checked the shed next. Inside were the usual tools, an axe, a rusty saw, some old tarps. Nothing looked disturbed. I grabbed the axe anyway and kept it close as I moved through the day. My plan had been to go on a long hike, but now I didn't want to stray far. I stayed near the cabin, gathering wood, keeping busy. The second night was worse. I locked up early, triple-checking the door. I even wedged a chair under the knob. The axe stayed beside me as I lay in bed, every noise setting my nerves on edge. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the tree line this time, circling the cabin. Not coming straight for it like before, just watching. The footsteps would stop, then start again, circling, closer, then farther. I gripped the axe, my hands sweating. Then came the worst part, breathing, low, steady breathing, just outside the window, not moving, just standing there. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. I waited. Minutes passed, stretching into eternity. And then, finally, the footsteps retreated, back into the woods, gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed up. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded my bag, threw everything into the truck, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. My hands trembled on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. I never found out who it was. There were no other cabins nearby, no official trails leading to that area. Just deep, empty forest. I told the owner when I returned the keys. He shrugged, said sometimes drifters passed through, but they usually left people alone. I knew better. Whoever it was, they hadn't been passing through. They had been watching, waiting, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think they would have just tested the door again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, miles from the nearest town. No distractions, no noise, just me, the trees, and the quiet hum of nature. It was something I had needed for a long time. Life in the city had worn me down. Constant noise, constant motion, never a moment to just sit and breathe. Out here, I would finally have time to clear my mind. The cabin itself was small, built decades ago but well maintained. It belonged to a friend of a friend, someone who only used it during hunting season. It was simple. One room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, a bed against the far wall, and a bathroom in a separate shed out back. The generator only ran a few hours a day to conserve fuel, and there was no cell service. That was the appeal, complete isolation. The first couple of days passed peacefully. I spent my mornings hiking the dense trails surrounding the cabin, the afternoons fishing in a nearby stream, and the evenings sitting on the small porch, watching the sky darken and the stars take over. At night, the silence was heavy, almost pressing, but I liked it. It was a change from the constant hum of traffic and sirens I was used to. The first sign that something was off came on the third night. I had woken up suddenly, my heart pounding for no reason I could remember. The room was silent except for the faint crackling of the dying fire in the wood stove. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, but I heard nothing unusual. The trees outside were still, and the wind had died down. After a while, I lay back down, convincing myself it had just been a bad dream. But the feeling stayed with me. The next morning, I found tracks near the cabin, large, deep impressions in the dirt, too big to be from a deer. I frowned, crouching down to inspect them. They looked human, barefoot. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Maybe a hunter passing through, I told myself. But why would anyone be out here barefoot? I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my chest. That night, I locked the cabin door, a habit I hadn't bothered with before. I made sure the windows were latched and kept the hatchet I used for splitting wood within reach. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the tension in my body. The next night, I woke up again, this time to a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. It was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, not aggressive, almost like someone was idly knocking their fingers against the wood. I forced myself to move, slowly sitting up and reaching for the flashlight on the bedside table. My hands felt clammy, my grip unsteady. The tapping stopped the moment the beam of light cut through the darkness. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing, just the trees shifting slightly in the breeze. I barely slept the rest of the night. The following morning, I circled the cabin, looking for anything out of place. The dirt behind the cabin was disturbed, but no clear footprints. The tapping could have been a loose branch in the wind, I told myself, though I didn't fully believe it. I thought about cutting the trip short, but I pushed the thought away. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin this. I had come out here to escape stress, not create more of it. That night, I made sure the fire was burning strong before I went to bed. I kept the flashlight next to me, my boots on the floor in case I needed to move fast. I told myself I wouldn't let my nerves get to me again. I would sleep through the night, but I didn't. I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. Not tapping this time, something moving outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. My pulse pounded in my ears. I lay frozen, listening as they moved around the cabin, slow and steady. Not an animal. Too heavy, too controlled. I reached for the hatchet, my grip tightening around the handle. The footsteps stopped near the front door, then a long, heavy silence. I didn't breathe. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? Or something else? The door handle moved. Just a slight rattle, a test. My stomach clenched. I wanted to call out, tell whoever it was to leave, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound making my heart pound. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the trees. Everything looked normal, untouched. But when I turned to close the cabin door, my breath caught in my throat. A handprint, smudged into the wood, just beside the handle, larger than mine, and streaked with dirt. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A full weekend alone in a secluded cabin deep in the woods sounded like the perfect way to unwind. No emails, no people, no noise. Just the quiet hum of nature, a few good books, and a chance to reset my mind. I found the cabin on an old listing site that specialized in off-grid rentals. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a cot against the far wall. The description had warned about the lack of electricity and running water, but that didn't bother me. I had camped alone plenty of times before, and this was just one step above that. Besides, the place had been cheap, and it sat miles away from the nearest road. Seclusion was exactly what I wanted. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last stretch was nothing but a winding dirt road full of deep potholes and washouts. My old SUV handled it well enough, but I had to take it slow. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already low in the sky. The place looked about how I expected. Weathered wood, a slanted tin roof, and a porch with a couple of old rocking chairs. No other cabins or structures in sight, just trees in every direction. Perfect. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and made my way inside. The inside was smaller than I thought, but cozy in a rough sort of way. A small wood stove sat in the corner, already stacked with kindling. A table with two mismatched chairs stood against one wall, and a few wooden shelves held an assortment of canned food, old cooking utensils, and a stack of yellowed newspapers. There was a faint smell of dust and wood smoke, but nothing unpleasant. It was exactly what I had wanted, or so I thought. The first few hours were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and started a fire in the wood stove to keep the chill away. I had brought a book, but I barely got through a few pages before my eyes grew heavy. It had been a long day, and the deep quiet of the woods settled over me like a heavy blanket. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but as I lay there listening, I realized it was something else. a soft, deliberate rustling just outside the cabin walls. I held my breath. The sound was too steady to be the wind and too rhythmic to be just the usual creaks and groans of an old structure settling. Something was moving outside, just beyond the thin wooden walls. I sat up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow in the room. My knife was in my pack across the room, but I didn't want to risk moving yet. I just listened. Soft footsteps in the leaves, slow, measured, circling the cabin. I swallowed hard. A bear? Maybe, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. It wasn't heavy enough for a bear, but it also didn't sound like a deer or anything else that should be out there at this hour. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped near the back wall of the cabin. Then silence. I strained my ears, trying to pick up anything in the darkness outside. Then a single, distinct sound. A long, slow drag of something sharp against the wood. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. I knew that now. I moved as quietly as I could, reaching for the flashlight in my bag. My fingers fumbled against the fabric, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to turn it on yet. I didn't want whoever or whatever was outside to know I was awake. Minutes passed. The scraping sound didn't return. The silence stretched on, pressing down on me. Then, another sound. Something tapping lightly against the window. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, near the front of the cabin, covered by an old curtain. I couldn't see out, but whoever was out there had to know I was inside. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my mind racing. I had my car, but it was parked a good 30 feet from the porch. If I ran for it, I'd be completely exposed. If they were waiting for that, I'd never make it. The tapping stopped. Silence again. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The minutes dragged by, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. My body ached from the tension. My eyes burned with the need for sleep, but I didn't dare close them. I sat there for hours, listening, waiting, but the footsteps never returned. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was still sitting upright, the flashlight clenched in my fist. My mind was screaming at me to leave. Whatever had been out there had been watching me, waiting. I packed up in record time. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I shoved everything into my bag, yanked open the door, and sprinted for my car. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, and I peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up dirt and gravel behind me. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my skin still crawling with the feeling of unseen eyes. I never found out who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back. I needed a break from everything: work, traffic, people. I found a cabin online, deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the city. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a metal roof, a wood stove, and a deck overlooking a small lake. The pictures showed a place that was rustic but comfortable enough. I booked it for a long weekend, packed my truck with supplies, and headed out. The last stretch of the drive was rough, a narrow dirt road winding through dense trees. My tires kicked up dust, and branches scraped the sides of my truck. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. The GPS cut out a while back, but I had written directions. Eventually, I spotted the cabin through the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures. Simple, quiet, isolated. I parked beside it, killed the engine, and let the silence settle in. No cars.
No voices.
Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of branches. Felt good. Peaceful. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the cabin. Inside, it smelled of wood and dust. A small kitchen with an old propane stove and a single counter. A main room with a couch, a coffee table, and a wood stove. A narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet. Everything was as expected. After unloading my gear, I took a walk down to the lake. It was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick trees. No docks, no boats, no houses on the other side. Just water and woods. I stood there for a while, listening. The silence was almost too much. I was used to the hum of the city, and without it, everything felt exposed. As the sun set, I built a fire outside and cooked dinner. The air cooled quickly. It got dark in a way it never did in the city. Real dark. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing in around me. Then I heard it. A noise, faint but distinct. A snap like a twig breaking underfoot. Came from the trees behind the cabin. I froze, listening. Silence. Could have been an animal. A deer? Maybe. I shook it off and went inside. I locked the door, even though I knew no one should be out here. The cabin had no curtains, and the darkness outside made the windows feel like black mirrors. I kept the lights low, not wanting to see my own reflection staring back at me. I tried to sleep, but every little noise outside made me tense up. The wind moved through the trees, making them creak and groan. I reminded myself that I was alone, that no one knew I was here, but that also meant if something happened, no one was coming. I must have drifted off because I woke up to something subtle. A change in the air, a feeling. I turned over and checked my phone. It was just past 2 a.m. The fire outside had died down, leaving only faint red embers. The cabin was pitch black. Then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not heavy, not running. Just slow, careful steps. Close. Too close. Right outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to hear, lying perfectly still. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were listening, waiting. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, heart hammering in my chest. I moved toward the window, staying low. The moon was out, casting just enough light for me to see. I peered through the glass. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. Then the footsteps came again, this time at the front door. A soft scrape against the wood. I grabbed my hunting knife from my bag and stood there, every muscle locked up. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The doorknob rattled. My stomach clenched. It wasn't just an animal. Someone was out there. The rattling stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. I stood in the dark for what felt like an hour, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to sit down against the wall, still gripping the knife. I listened. The footsteps never returned. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept in. As soon as it was bright enough, I went outside. The ground was damp from dew. I circled the cabin, checking for tracks. I found them. Boot prints. Not big, not small. Just normal. They led from the tree line around the cabin and back into the woods. No car tracks. No sign of anyone camping nearby. Just footprints in the dirt. I packed my things fast, tossed everything into my truck and got the hell out. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, until I saw another car, until I was far away from those woods. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but they knew I was there, and they weren't in a hurry. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was an old place, something my uncle had built years ago when he wanted a retreat from the world. No electricity, no plumbing, just 4 walls, a wood stove, and a creek a few hundred yards away for water. It sat deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, tucked between tall pines and thick underbrush. It wasn't the kind of place people just stumbled across. That's why I liked it. I'd been coming here for years, usually in the summer, but this time it was late fall, and the air carried the bite of early winter. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the woods looking skeletal and open in a way that made me feel exposed. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked the 2 miles in with my pack, the weight of supplies pressing into my shoulders. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was dimming, turning the trees into black silhouettes. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the hinges groaning from the cold. Inside, Everything was as I'd left it last time. A simple wooden table, a few chairs, a cot pushed against the far wall, and a small shelf with some old canned goods. Dust clung to everything, disturbed only by tiny mouse prints on the floor. I sighed, set my pack down, and got to work building a fire in the wood stove. The temperature was dropping fast, and I knew it'd be below freezing by nightfall. Once the fire was going, I lit my lantern and sat down at the table, eating a cold dinner from a can. The wind had picked up outside, whistling through the cracks in the logs. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you didn't get in the city. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A feeling that crawled along my spine and made me glance at the window more than I should have. I chalked it up to being alone in the woods and went about my routine. I locked the door, checked the shutters, and unrolled my sleeping bag onto the cot. The fire crackled in the stove, throwing flickering shadows across the walls. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up to a noise, something outside. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned low, casting only a dull orange glow. I could hear the wind, the rustling of branches, the creaking of the cabin settling. And then, crunch, footsteps. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the window. The glass was fogged over from my breath, making it hard to see. I wiped it with my sleeve and peered out into the dark. Nothing. The trees swayed, the wind whispering through the leaves still clinging to the branches. I stayed still, my skin prickling. It could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but the footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too heavy. I stood up as quietly as I could, grabbed my rifle from the wall, and stepped to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence now, just the wind. I debated opening the door but decided against it. Instead, I went back to the cot, keeping my rifle close, and lay down again, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, the fire had died completely, and the room was cold. A strange smell hung in the air, something damp and metallic. My skin crawled, but I didn't move at first. I just lay there listening, breathing, not mine. Slow, steady, coming from the other side of the room. I gripped my rifle and turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the door. It was open, just an inch, but enough to make my stomach twist into knots. I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't heard anything. The breathing stopped. I sat up, my pulse pounding. I swept the flashlight around the room. Nothing. The door barely moved, nudged by the wind. I stood slowly, my legs stiff and unsteady, and walked toward it. I reached out, heart hammering, and pushed it shut, sliding the latch into place. I checked the windows next, all locked. I circled the cabin, making sure nothing had been disturbed. Everything looked normal, but the smell still lingered, thick and sour. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach churn. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle in hand, eyes on the door. Nothing else happened, but that feeling never left. That sense that I wasn't alone. To first light, I packed my gear. I had planned to stay a few days, but something in me said to leave. As I stepped outside, the cold morning air burned my lungs. The forest was still, the ground damp with frost. I turned toward the trail, but something caught my eye near the tree line. Tracks, big ones, not boots, not an animal. Bare feet, deep in the mud, leading away from the cabin and vanishing into the trees. I didn't wait to investigate. I hiked back to my truck without stopping, not even when I thought I heard something moving behind me. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching. But there was nothing, just the empty woods and the cabin, standing silent in the morning light. I never went back. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A friend of a friend owned a small off-grid hunting cabin deep in the woods. a good 5-hour drive from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, some basic supplies, and the sound of the wind through the trees. No cell service, no distractions. Just a chance to unwind, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. The drive out there was uneventful, just long stretches of highway that eventually turned into winding dirt roads. By the time I reached the last stretch, a narrow logging trail barely wide enough for my truck, the sun was already dipping low. The forest closed in on both sides, dense with towering pines and undergrowth so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into it. The cabin itself sat at the end of a rough, overgrown path, nestled against the edge of a steep ridge. It was small, little more than a single-room structure with a covered porch, but it was solid, thick log walls, a heavy wooden door, a single window facing the clearing in front. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall. A small cot was pushed into the corner, and a rough wooden table sat near the window. There were no lights, no running water, just a few old oil lamps hanging from hooks and a rusty wood stove near the back wall. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my gear, checking the woodpile outside. It was stacked high against the wall, dry and neatly cut. Whoever had been here last had made sure the place was ready for the next visitor. I lit one of the oil lamps, started a small fire in the stove, and made a quick meal from a can of beans and some jerky. By the time I stepped outside again, night had fully settled in. The quiet was absolute. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I stood on the porch for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The clearing in front of the cabin stretched about 50 feet before the tree line swallowed everything. Beyond that, just blackness, the forest stretching for miles in every direction. It was peaceful, but there was something else, too. An odd feeling I couldn't quite shake. A weight in the air, something pressing at the edges of my senses. Not fear exactly, but unease. Like standing in a room you know is empty, but still feeling like someone is watching you. I shook it off, told myself I was just adjusting to the isolation. It had been a long drive. I was tired. The fire was warm. The cot looked inviting, and I had a full weekend ahead of me. No point in getting worked up over nothing. That first night, I slept deeply. I woke once, hours later, to the distant sound of something moving through the brush outside, but I told myself it was just an animal and drifted back into sleep. The next morning was crisp and cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones before the sun has a chance to warm the air. I made coffee over the fire, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore a bit. The ridge behind the cabin was steep but not impassable, and I wanted to see what kind of view I could get from the top. I hiked for about an hour, the forest thick and untouched. The only sounds the crunch of my boots on the damp earth and the occasional bird call. When I finally reached the crest of the ridge, I was met with a breathtaking view. A vast stretch of forest, unbroken except for a distant river snaking through the valley far below. I sat for a while, enjoying the stillness, before heading back down. That's when I noticed something strange. About halfway back to the cabin, I caught sight of something through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, I realized it was something much more unsettling. Tracks. Not animal tracks. Human tracks. Fresh, deep impressions in the damp earth, leading down the slope in the direction of the cabin. I stopped, heart hammering against my ribs. I had been alone out here since I arrived. I had seen no other cars, no signs of anyone else. But these tracks were new. I followed them, moving carefully, ears straining for any sound beyond my own breathing. The closer I got to the cabin, the more uneasy I felt. The tracks led straight to the porch, stopping just at the base of the steps. Then they turned and led away, disappearing into the woods. I stood there for a long time, scanning the tree line, my pulse loud in my ears. Whoever had been here had come up to the cabin, stood there for a moment, then left. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't called out. They had just stood there, watching. I swallowed hard, trying to think rationally. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone had gotten lost and come across the cabin by chance. That made sense. It had to be that, but something about it felt wrong. The way the tracks stopped, the way they lingered. I forced myself to shake it off, went inside, and locked the door. The rest of the day passed slowly, the unease never fully leaving. I spent most of it inside, listening, waiting, straining to hear something beyond the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wind against the walls. Night fell again, and with it came the same heavy silence. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, my body tense with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't bring rest. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locking into place. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped, right outside the door. I stayed frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then finally the steps retreated, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and left without looking back. I never found out who it was, never found out what they wanted. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been out there wasn't lost. They weren't hunting, they had been waiting. I never planned on staying in that cabin. It was supposed to be just a temporary shelter, a place to stop for the night before I continued my drive deeper into the mountains. But as the rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windshield, my old truck started making a sound I didn't like, a deep, rhythmic knocking from the engine. I barely had enough signal to look up the closest town, but I could see I wouldn't make it. That's when I saw the dirt road turnoff, barely visible through the rain, and the small wooden sign that just read lodging. The road was rough, winding through dense forest, and I had to keep the truck in low gear to crawl through deep puddles and slick mud. I was just about to turn around when I saw it. A small cabin, dark against the trees, with a sagging front porch and a single light glowing from within. There was no sign, no indication it was a business, but at that point, I didn't care. I needed a place out of the rain, and if someone lived there, I'd offer them cash to let me sleep on the floor for the night. I pulled up and cut the engine. The knocking sound had gotten worse, and I knew in the pit of my stomach I was probably stuck there until I could figure something out. I climbed out of the truck, pulling my hood up against the rain, and walked to the porch. The light inside flickered slightly, not like a bulb going out, but like firelight. There was a woodpile beside the door, stacked high, and the faint smell of smoke in the air. Someone was home. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. I tried the handle, turned easily, the door swinging open with a creak. Inside, a fire burned in a stone fireplace, low but steady, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The cabin was small, just a single room with a bed, a table, a few chairs, and a small kitchen area. A doorway led to what I assumed was a bathroom. Everything was neat, but there were no personal items. No clothes, no food on the counters, no dishes in the sink. Just the fire, burning as if someone had just been there. I stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor, and called out, "Hello!" Nothing. I should have left. I should have gotten back in my truck, no matter how bad the engine sounded. But the wind howled outside, and the warmth of the fire was so inviting. I was exhausted, my clothes soaked, my boots heavy with mud. I hesitated just a little too long, and that was all it took to make up my mind. I'd rest here just for a few hours. If someone showed up, I'd apologize and explain. But for now, I needed to dry off and warm up. I closed the door behind me, locking it out of habit, and peeled off my wet jacket. The fire felt good, and I sat in one of the chairs, stretching my hands toward the heat. The quiet was almost unsettling after the storm outside. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wind against the cabin walls. Then I noticed the rifle. It was propped against the wall near the door, old but well-maintained. Not unusual in a remote cabin like this, but it made my skin prickle. If this place was abandoned, why would someone leave a rifle behind? And if it wasn't abandoned, Why would they leave the fire going and the door unlocked? I told myself I'd only stay an hour or two, long enough to dry off and figure out what to do next. My truck wouldn't get me far, and I wasn't about to start hiking in the middle of a storm. I pulled a chair closer to the fire and tried to relax. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed it. The feeling, that strange, creeping sensation that someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dim room. Nothing. Just the fire, the furniture, the closed door leading to the other room. But the feeling wouldn't go away. My skin prickled, my pulse quickened. I swallowed hard and stood, moving toward the doorway. If there was someone else here, I needed to know. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just a small bed, a dresser, a window with rain streaking down the glass. No closet, nowhere for anyone to hide. But the feeling didn't go away. I backed out, shutting the door behind me. Something felt wrong. The cabin was too still, too quiet. The fire burned, the rifle sat where it was. But something about this place didn't sit right with me. My gut told me to leave. Then I heard it, a soft creak, from the porch. My blood went cold. I moved slowly, stepping toward the window beside the door. The glass was fogged, but I could just barely make out a dark shape on the porch. A figure, standing still, just outside the door. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Another creak, a shift of weight. They were standing just on the other side of the door, listening. I reached for the rifle. The handle on the door rattled. Not forceful, not aggressive, just testing. My heart pounded. I gripped the rifle tight, my hands clammy. The door was locked, but I knew locks wouldn't mean much if they wanted to get in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed frozen, listening, waiting. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside, but no more sounds came from the porch. I waited until my legs ached, until my breath slowed. Finally, I moved toward the window again, pressing my forehead against the glass, trying to see. Nothing, just darkness and rain. Had they left, or were they still out there, waiting? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle across my lap, eyes locked on the door. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin made my pulse jump, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement, just the storm, the fire, and the thick, suffocating weight of dread sitting heavy in my chest. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I finally dared to move. I unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, stepping onto the damp porch. The rain had stopped, leaving behind thick mud and wet leaves, and footprints, deep, heavy footprints leading up to the door, but none leading away. The drive up to the cabin took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were on a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck. It twisted through dense forest, the tall pines casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. The farther I drove, the rougher the road got, until I was crawling along at barely 10 miles an hour, dodging deep ruts and loose rocks. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the still air, making it hard to see much behind me. I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, built from rough-hewn logs that had turned gray with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the front porch had a slight tilt to it, but it looked sturdy enough. A single window faced the clearing, the glass streaked with dirt. There was no sign of anyone around. No other cars, no footprints in the dust. Just silence, except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I stepped out of my truck and stretched my legs, my back stiff from the long drive. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and walked up to the door. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like the owner had said in his email. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchenette against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow cot against the opposite wall. There was a battered old table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves stocked with canned food and a couple of dusty bottles of whiskey. The air was stale, like no one had been inside for months. I opened the window to let in some fresh air and set my bag down on the cot. I had rented the cabin for a week. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and time to clear my head. I had been feeling burned out lately, stretched too thin by work and life. I needed a break, and this seemed like the perfect place to get one. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up my gear, and making sure everything was in order. There was a small stack of firewood outside, just enough for a couple of nights. The owner had said I'd need to cut more if I planned on using the wood stove regularly. There was an axe leaning against the side of the cabin, the blade rusty but still sharp. As the sun dipped lower, I started a fire in the wood stove to take the chill out of the air. I cooked a simple meal on the propane burner, ate in silence, then sat on the porch with a beer, watching the last light fade from the sky. The woods grew darker, the trees merging into a solid wall of black. The air cooled quickly, and the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant howl of a coyote. I felt calm, more relaxed than I had in months. The solitude was exactly what I needed. I turned in early, climbing into the cot and pulling the thick blankets over me. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the dying fire in the stove. I listened for a while, then drifted off to sleep. I woke sometime in the night, unsure of what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow across the room. I lay still, listening. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, making the branches creak. I started to close my eyes again when I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep outside the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind. Then, another step, slow, heavy. I sat up, my pulse hammering. I reached for the flashlight on the small table beside the cot and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough wooden walls. My ears strained for another sound, but everything was silent again. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a bear moving through the trees, but something about the steps had sounded off. Too steady, too careful. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. I moved to the window and shined the flashlight outside. The beam flickered through the trees, casting long shadows, but I saw nothing. The clearing was empty. My truck sat where I had parked it, undisturbed. I turned back toward the door, debating whether to check outside. Then I saw it, the handle of the door. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was turning. A spike of fear shot through me. I grabbed the hunting knife from my bag and took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The handle stopped moving. Silence. I stood frozen, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to move, to do something, but fear held me in place. Then, after what felt like an eternity, slow, heavy footsteps retreated from the door. They crunched through the gravel, moving away from the cabin. Then, nothing. Just the wind again. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. I stayed up the rest of the night, my back against the wall, the knife still clutched in my hand. The footsteps never returned. At first light, I opened the door and stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, but in the dirt, just beyond the porch, were footprints. Deep, heavy, human. I didn't wait to see if whoever had been outside would come back. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the truck, and left. The cabin faded in the rearview mirror as I sped down the dirt road, not slowing until I hit pavement miles later. I never went back, never told the owner what happened. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I know they were watching, listening, waiting, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some quiet. It was deep in the woods, far from any town, just the way I liked it. The place was old but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a sloping metal roof that rattled when the wind picked up. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense pines. It was late in the season, early winter, the kind of time when the woods were empty except for the few who didn't mind the cold. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time chopping firewood, fishing through a hole in the ice, and hiking the trails nearby. The nights were long and quiet. The only sounds came from the wind and the occasional creaking of the trees. Felt isolated, peaceful. But then small things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. My axe wasn't where I had left it. I found my fishing pole lying on the ground a few feet from where I had propped it against the cabin. The back door, which I was certain I had latched, swung open one night, letting in a gust of frigid air. I told myself I was just being forgetful. I had been alone for a few days. Maybe I was losing track of things. Then, one evening, as I was walking back from the lake with a few fish, I saw footprints in the snow near the cabin. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, like someone wearing thick boots had walked up to the cabin and stopped near the window before turning away. The sight of them made my skin crawl. I hadn't heard a vehicle, hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. Whoever it was had come through the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. I locked the doors, checked the windows, made sure my knife was within reach. I told myself it was probably a hunter, maybe a hiker who got lost and wandered by. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. There was nothing out here. No trails leading to the cabin, no reason for someone to come this way. The next morning, I followed the tracks as far as I could before they disappeared into the trees. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. The forest was still, just the sound of snow crunching beneath my boots. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. That night, I woke up to a sound outside, a slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. They moved around the cabin, stopping near the window. My heart pounded. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up, gripping the knife. The door was locked, but I knew whoever was outside was trying to get in. The rattling stopped, and then silence. The kind of silence that made my ears ring. I didn't move. I didn't even look out the window. I just sat there, waiting. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to daylight streaming through the cracks in the curtains. The snow outside was disturbed. A clear set of prints leading from the trees to the door, then back into the woods. I packed my things. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't just some lost hiker. Someone had come out here, deep into the woods, to find me. And I wasn't going to wait around to see if they'd come back. As I loaded my truck, I felt eyes on me, that heavy, unmistakable feeling of being watched. I scanned the trees but saw nothing, just empty woods, stretching in all directions. I got in, locked the doors, and started driving. The cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I never went back. The road to the cabin was little more than a winding dirt track, carved through dense pine and fir. I'd taken a wrong turn at least once, doubling back on myself through a maze of nearly identical trees. The rental's GPS cut out an hour back, leaving me to rely on an old paper map I'd found stuffed in the glove box. It had taken longer than expected, but I finally spotted the turnoff, a narrow gap between trees marked only by a weathered wooden post, half buried in pine needles. The cabin sat at the end of a sloping gravel path, barely visible through the thick trees. It was an old place, probably built in the 50s, a single-story structure with a steeply pitched roof and a small covered porch. The wood siding was faded and rough, gray from years of exposure. The windows were dark, reflecting only the forest behind me. A metal chimney jutted from the roof, but no smoke curled from it. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind through the trees, no bird calls, not even the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Just stillness. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, making you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of moss and decaying wood. My bag was slung over one shoulder, a cooler in my other hand, as I made my way up the short steps to the porch. The front door was stiff, the old wood swollen with humidity, but it gave after a few hard shoves. The inside smelled of dust and stale air, with a lingering scent of damp wood smoke. The cabin was small but functional. A single large room made up the living area, kitchen, and dining space, with a doorway leading to what I assumed was a bedroom. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with two mismatched chairs, a couch that looked older than I was, and a heavy cast iron stove tucked into the corner. A stack of firewood sat next to it, though some of the logs had gone soft with rot. I dropped my bag by the couch and set the cooler down on the table. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a few nights to clear my head, get away from work, from people. I'd been running on empty for months, and the idea of absolute solitude had been appealing. No phone service, no internet, just me and the forest. After unpacking, I went outside to gather firewood. The forest was thick, the trees packed close together, their trunks slick with moss. I found a few dry branches near the base of a fallen tree and snapped them into manageable pieces, stuffing them under one arm. As I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something. A path, barely visible, cutting through the trees to the right of the clearing. It was narrow, overgrown with ferns and brambles, as if it hadn't been used in years. I hadn't seen it on my way in. Something about it unsettled me, but I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in around it, the darkness that pooled beneath the branches even in daylight. I turned away, forcing myself to ignore it. I had no reason to go wandering through unfamiliar woods, especially alone. Back inside, I built a small fire in the stove, watching as the flames licked at the dry wood. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin, chasing away the damp chill. I made a simple dinner, eating in silence, listening to the occasional creak of the old structure as it settled. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches against the roof. That night, I slept lightly. The bed was old, the mattress thin, springs pressing uncomfortably against my back. More than that, though, it was the silence that kept me awake. It wasn't natural. No wind, no night sounds, just the occasional crackle of the cooling stove. I kept expecting to hear something, an animal moving outside, the distant hoot of an owl, but there was nothing. Sometime in the early hours, I woke suddenly, heart hammering. The cabin was completely dark, the fire having burned down to embers. I strained my ears, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal, not the scurrying of rodents in the walls. Human footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. The sound circled the cabin, crunching through the undergrowth, pausing every few steps. I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to sit up. I just lay there, listening as the footsteps made a slow circuit around the cabin, once, twice. Then they stopped. Minutes passed. My ears rang with the silence. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, my pulse pounding in my temples. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined it, there was a soft sound. Tap, just one. A single, light knock against the front door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, another tap. Then another. Not loud, not urgent, just testing. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. My bag was by the couch, my flashlight inside. I reached for it, hands shaking, and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the door. Nothing. The knocks had stopped. I forced myself to stand, moving as silently as I could to the window. The porch was empty. Beyond it, only darkness, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I didn't sleep after that, just sat by the dying fire, listening, waiting. Morning came slowly, the sky a dull gray. I stepped outside, my breath curling in the cold air. The forest was quiet, but something felt off. I walked around the cabin, searching for footprints, but the ground was undisturbed. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But as I turned back toward the cabin, my stomach twisted. The path, the overgrown trail I had noticed the day before. The ferns and brambles that had nearly covered it had been trampled, pushed aside as if something or someone had passed through recently. I didn't hesitate. I packed my bag, loaded the cooler into the car, and left. The cabin could keep its secrets. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of the path in my rearview mirror. It wasn't empty. A figure stood there, just at the tree line, watching. I didn't stop. I took the turn off the main road and started the slow drive up the dirt path leading deep into the woods. The rental cabin was a few miles in, tucked away from everything, and that was exactly what I wanted. A break from everything. Work had been grinding me down, my personal life felt like it was in pieces, and I needed to step away from the world for a while. The road was rougher than I expected. Deep ruts from old rainstorms had hardened into jagged dips, making my truck jolt with each bump. Trees crowded the path, their branches hanging low enough that I could hear them scraping the roof as I passed. The deeper I went, the denser the woods became. The daylight filtering through the trees was dim, the sky barely visible through the thick canopy. It felt like the kind of place where time slowed down. I finally spotted the cabin through the trees. It was small, made of old weathered logs, with a steep roof and a covered porch that sagged slightly on one side. A stone chimney stuck out from the side, darkened by years of smoke stains. There was no sign of recent use. The grass around it was knee-high, the dirt driveway covered in leaves and twigs. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the quiet. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of the city, just the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful, but also isolating in a way I hadn't fully expected. I stepped out and stretched my legs, breathing in the cool, damp air. The woods smelled of pine and earth, mixed with the faint scent of decay from rotting leaves. The front door was unlocked, just as the rental company had told me. It groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint musk of old wood and dust. The cabin was simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a door leading to a single bedroom. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and a threadbare couch faced the fireplace. A few old oil lamps rested on a shelf, along with some faded books that looked untouched for years. There was no electricity, just a wood-burning stove for cooking and a well outside for water. I set my bags down near the couch and started checking the place over. The kitchen shelves held a few old canned goods, mostly expired. The stove was coated in a fine layer of ash. The bed in the other room was stiff, the sheets smelling like they hadn't been washed in years. I brought my own sleeping bag, so I wasn't too worried about it. After getting settled, I grabbed my axe and headed outside to gather firewood. The air had a sharp chill to it, the kind that hinted at an early frost coming soon. I found a dead tree not far from the cabin and started chopping, the rhythmic sound of the axe cutting through the silence. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. Not wrong exactly, but different. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. By the time I had enough wood stacked near the cabin, the sun was sinking low behind the trees. The temperature dropped fast, and I hurried inside to get a fire going. The flames caught quickly, filling the cabin with a warm, flickering light. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, then sat back with a beer watching the fire dance. It should have been relaxing, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping in around the edges of my thoughts. I heard it for the first time just after midnight. A sound outside, faint but distinct. A crunch of leaves, like a footstep. I sat up on the couch, heart suddenly hammering. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind, probably an animal. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination getting the better of me. But then it happened again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step, not the quick, skittering movement of a deer or a raccoon. It sounded heavier, human. I stood up, moving to the window, but the night outside was pitch black. The fire inside made it impossible to see anything beyond my own reflection in the glass. I turned off the lantern, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, and waited. The woods were silent again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe just the house settling. I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire burning low, and eventually drifted off. I woke up suddenly, unsure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in deep shadows. My breath was visible in the cold air. I listened. The sound was back, closer, right outside the door. A slow, dragging step, followed by another. I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming. Someone was out there. I reached for the axe I'd left near the fireplace and gripped it tight, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I listened. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. A slow, testing movement. Not forceful, just checking. My grip on the axe tightened. My mind raced. No one should be out here. The nearest town was miles away. The knob rattled again, harder this time. I stood up, moving silently toward the door. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a slow breath, then yanked the door open, swinging the axe up. Nothing. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were still. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind through the trees. But I knew what I'd heard. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. My breath came fast and uneven. The firelight flickered behind me, casting my shadow long across the ground. The dirt in front of the door was disturbed. Faint, but there. Footprints. Large, heavy ones, leading from the woods to my door, and then back again. I turned slowly, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching, testing the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat near the fire, axe in hand, staring at the door, waiting. The sounds never came back, but the feeling didn't leave. At dawn, I packed my things. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the truck and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just far enough back that I couldn't make out any details. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I never went back, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps outside the door, and I wonder if they ever stopped watching. The drive up to the cabin was already enough to make me question if I had made a mistake. It was a narrow, winding dirt road that snaked its way through the thick forest, the kind of road that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. My tires kicked up loose gravel, and every now and then, a deep rut in the road made my truck jolt, forcing me to slow down even more. The further I got, the denser the trees became, their branches hanging low enough that they scraped against my windshield and roof. There were no signs, no mile markers, nothing to indicate how far I had left to go. Just my GPS, which kept glitching out, the blue dot lagging behind my actual position. I had rented the place for a long weekend. The owner had listed it as an off-grid getaway. A small, isolated cabin in the middle of the mountains, perfect for people wanting to escape from the noise of the world. I wanted to spend some time alone, away from everything, and this seemed like the perfect place. No service, no distractions, just me and the quiet. When I finally arrived, the first thing I noticed was how small the cabin looked compared to the trees surrounding it. It was an old wooden structure with a steep roof and a narrow front porch, tucked between towering pines. The logs were dark with age, the windows small and dirty. There was no driveway, just a clearing big enough to park my truck. A pile of firewood sat against the side of the cabin, some of it rotting, and a rusted metal barrel stood nearby, probably used for burning trash. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing but the sound of the wind moving through the trees. No birds, no animals, just the wind. The inside of the cabin was exactly what I expected, small and simple. A single room with a wood stove, a bed pushed up against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no running water, just a big plastic jug sitting on the counter. A narrow door led to a bathroom, but it only had a dry toilet, the kind that needed to be emptied after a few days. The air inside smelled stale, like dust and old wood. I set my bags down, checked the corners for spiders, then stepped back outside to bring in more supplies from the truck. That was when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the front steps. Large boot prints, deep enough to show that whoever made them had been standing there for a while. I frowned, looking around. The rental listing had said the place was private, that no one else would be around. But these tracks were fresh. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind or rain, and they weren't mine. I had only just arrived. I followed the tracks a few steps. They led up to the porch, then stopped right in front of the door. Not moving side to side, not turning around. Just stopping, like someone had stood there, staring at the door for a long time before walking away. I felt a chill crawl up my back. I looked around again, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the woods, thick and endless. I told myself it was probably the owner checking on the place earlier in the day. Maybe they had come by to make sure everything was in order before I arrived. Still, it left me uneasy. I grabbed my bags quickly and went inside, locking the door behind me. The first night was quiet, too quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals moving through the forest. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind pressing against the walls. I barely slept. The next morning, I went outside to gather some firewood. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at your fingers. That was when I saw it. More footprints, but this time they were different. These weren't boot prints. They were barefoot, and they circled the cabin. My stomach tightened. The prints were spaced apart, like whoever made them had been moving slowly. Cautiously, they started near the trees, then went around the entire cabin before stopping near the front porch again. I felt exposed standing there in the open. I scanned the tree line, my breath coming in short puffs. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. But I knew someone had been here, watching me while I slept. I hurried back inside and locked the door again, my hands shaking. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear, maybe someone camping nearby who got lost. But I knew that wasn't true. The steps were human. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I kept the wood stove burning, even though I didn't need it. Something about the fire made me feel safer. That night, I lay in bed with my knife within reach, listening. Hours passed. The wind picked up, howling against the cabin. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft creak. The front porch. I stopped breathing. I strained my ears, listening. Another creak. Someone was out there, standing on the porch. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping out of bed, keeping low. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Another creak, closer to the door. I slowly reached for my flashlight, pressing the button. The beam cut through the darkness as I aimed it toward the front door. Nothing. The porch was empty, but the door handle was moving. I lunged forward and slammed the deadbolt, pressing my weight against the door. Silence. Then the soft sound of footsteps retreating, moving back down the steps, moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my things, threw them into the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled away, I saw something in the dirt near the cabin. More footprints, leading from the forest. But this time, there was more than one set. I didn't stop to look closer. I didn't stop for anything. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When I finally got back to town, I sent a message to the owner, letting them know I was leaving early. I didn't tell them what happened. I didn't want to explain. I just wanted to forget. I never heard back. I still think about it sometimes. About who or what was out there. About why they were watching. About what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door in time. I don't think I'll ever go back. And I don't think I was the first person it happened to.